me not see the audience.
Couldn't see it because of the lighting? These chairs are too low for this table. Find out.
You know, on the flyer, they said financial center, but no, it's Brookfield Place, right?
That's because there's no financial market anymore.
A little behind us, I can think of the name.
Well, that's what it was when it was built. Right. It was the World Financial Center when it was built.
Yeah, I know.
But it's not the building.
Right. But he's there now in Brookfield.
No, no.
Oh, he's not?
No, no.
Move on.
You are, sorry, I don't know.
Oh, no, I'm Bob Harris. I'm a loved one of those.
Oh, good.
And you?
I'm hopefully wrong.
Oh, I see, yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Maybe that small group,
No.
in the first 3 rows.
Oh, nobody ever sits in the front row. That's why I put my coat there, because you know nobody ever sits. In fact, I've told students when you design a classroom, leave the front row out.
But you sort of like to see the reactions.
Yes, you do. And you can move forward. Those of you sitting way in the back, why don't you move forward?
But you don't have to if you want to leave early.
No, move forward so that we can see your reactions to all the outrageous things that these guys say. Have you been downtown to see what they've done?
No, I keep meaning to, but I think I'll wait till spring.
Have you been to see the Four Freedoms Park yet?
Yes,
It's amazing, I thought.
yeah, it's beautiful, really nicely done. And you know, that was Ed's dream, and he could never get it funded during his lifetime. And I think it's the last thing Louis Kahn designed, but I don't know that for sure.
Well, it's fabulous. It's also an amazing piece of construction. I mean, those granite blocks, did you look through the space? It's got these huge granite blocks that are like 60 tons each, and they are mounted so that there's like a half inch space between them, and you can look through.
They're all true?
It is so perfect. It's like it came out of a machine. Who built it? Siami. And Joe Mizzi, who's head of Siami, was president, was here the last one. And I asked him afterwards, how did you do that? He said, well, Port Morris figured it out, and they brought them in by barge, obviously.
Yeah, easier than by truck.
Yeah, and then, and what they did was they drilled holes on the top, and they put pins in the holes, and then they lifted them and they set the rays. And then they filled the holes.
Interesting. Yeah, it was beautiful. I was out there on a great day. It was really exciting.
I think we'll just wait another minute or two. Yeah. Well, his sons have carried on the tradition pretty successfully.
Actually,
Yeah, right, senior, yeah.
you should have pulled that out to read to the class his glowing words about how architects make 90% of the difference as to whether a project works or not.
Really?
Yes.
90% of the difference of,
Whether a project is successful or not.
I don't know, it's 90, I think it's pretty high.
Well, it all depends on where it
And the,
is.
to paraphrase, and the developers of the other 90%.
Right, like Yogi.
Let's see if I can get the picture. No network connection. Okay.
All kinds of people sitting here with computers that seem to have connection. Or maybe they're just taking notes.
Do you get Do you get an internet connection, a Wi-Fi connection in here? Is there a password? Because Michael says that there was an interesting obituary about William Zeckendorf Jr. talking about architects in today's times. Okay, well.
Overfilling up.
Yeah. Coming in late is a school tradition, I think. I was going to say Columbia tradition, probably every school. I started last week, or 2 weeks ago, I started off by saying to the third-year students, you're going to have more fun here today than last time we were in this room together, because last time we were in the room together was in December for the final exam.
I can't see that. Is Christine staying?
Yeah, there's her coach. She went to get something to eat. Christine doesn't like to sit around. If it involves sitting around, count her over. There she is. The other thing that's instructed is to talk into the microphone.
This is really disconcerting. You cannot see facial expressions very well beyond the fourth.
Think of
row.
yourself as a movie actor. Since it's useful for us to see your expressions, or whether you're still awake even, if the people in the back could move forward, that would be helpful to us. Sorry to be so dictatorial.
The alternative is to do it the way you get 40 centers, which is you get up and you want to do the aisles.
Pardon me?
Can eat. They can eat in here.
Yeah, they know that. They're not allowed to. What? Right. Well, I always say to students, leave out the first row when you do a classroom. It won't be used. Okay, we might as well start. And if history is any lesson, more people will kind of dribble in, and they'll miss the very exciting beginning, but you can tell them all about it. This is the second in the series, and what we're going to hear from today, or who we're going to hear from today, are owners. And we're very, very lucky today to have two very significant and important owners who are responsible for very important projects. Michael Dennis, who was started out doing housing in Toronto and then became the person in charge of Olympia in New York's World Financial Center down in Battery Park City and all the buildings there, and then moved from there to be the chief executive of Canary Wharf and in London, which probably many of you have seen, and was responsible for the buildings there. And Michael's going to talk about, from the developer's point of view, from a for-profit developer's point of view. Larry Goldman began working at the Urban Development Corporation and then was head of Roosevelt Island, and then after that went to Carnegie Hall, where he was in charge of getting Carnegie Hall Towers built, and then from there was the founding CEO, and then ran New Jersey Performing Arts Center in Newark, probably the most significant art center in New Jersey, if not in America. and a major urban development project in Newark, New Jersey's largest city. And Larry was there from the very beginning, did the planning or worked with the planners, and then hired the architect and worked with the architect, then operated it for 15 years, so got to see what worked and didn't work with what the architect had done, and is now developing adjacent sites that NJPAC controls. So Larry is very experienced with not-for-profit institutions and how they develop projects. And so what we're going to do is we're going to hear first some general thoughts from each of them just about the process, not so much about architects, and then we'll get into the issues about relationships between owners and architects. And I'm sure we'll learn a lot. So, Michael, do you want to start off?
What I was asked to do was to comment, excuse me, on how and why an owner chooses an architect, how an architect adds value, and in what cases you wouldn't want to use a specific architect. And I assume at some point we'll get to that. But I thought the starting point would be what a developer does. In fact, the answers to 5 questions: what, why, how, who, and where. The last 3 of how, who, and where will be interrelated. In fact, the whole process of acquiring and developing a property is both an iterative and an interactive one. I should say, to start with, I assume that the audience is primarily architectural students. Paul has said that there may be a number of people who know more about development. I'm going to assume that that the background to the development process requires a bit of explanation. Those of you who already know what I'm going to say, bear with me. And I thought I'd start first, though, with an analogy. You've read a novel, and you were quite intrigued with it, and you decided that you wanted to make a movie. And so you said, okay, let me figure out how to do that. Well, I've got to get the rights to the script. I've got to find somebody to, the rights to the novel. Then I've got to find a script writer to write a script. I've got to get a director, a casting director, a cinematographer, assemble a cast, and I'm ready to go. Oops, not quite yet. I don't have the money. And I have to figure out, am I going to get it from the bank? Am I going to raise equity? Am I going to get a studio to be my partner? And as I go to talk to those people, they say, well, how do you know that you're going to be able to get the revenue to pay back the loan or get a return to the investors? And so I have to go out and figure out how to market this movie. I sell the European rights, or I sell the television rights. I go find a distributor. And that's the real estate development process by analogy. You drive by a vacant lot regularly and you say, you know, I think I'd like to put a building on that. Or a broker approaches you and says, that strip on 57th Street between 6th and 8th is red hot, and there's a parcel available, and you should buy it. Both of those, let's talk about 57th Street. That sounds like a nice idea. I have to figure out what I think I want to put on it. Whether, do I want to put an apartment building or a hotel or an office building or retail or all of the above? Do I have the right to do it? I don't have the right to do it. Can I get an approval? Once I know what it is I want to do, how do I know that there's a market for it? And so I've done some of this stuff before myself, but I go to marketing specialists, usually brokers, who tell me whether or not at the price or rent that I have in mind, it can be taken up. Once I'm sort of satisfied with that, I need to decide whether I've got the money once again, just like the movie producer. Will somebody lend me the money to build it? Will they, if I'm going to keep owning it, will they lend me the money to repay the person who lent me the money? Where's the equity coming from? And so for the marketing, I've got one set of advisors. For finance, I've got financial brokers or bankers. And then assuming that I've got the answers to those two, and I've decided that even though I can't put the building up by right, I can get a planning approval for some changes. I'm almost ready to go. I have to figure out whether or not within the budget, which I have, in hearing about the site, taken out my envelope and written down on the back of the envelope, X% land, X% building, the rest for soft costs, interest, and there's 6 or 7% left out of those soft costs for architects and engineers. So I need a team of lawyers to help me with approvals, acquisition, financing, marketing. I need marketing specialists, brokers to help me decide that I can market the product I put up. I need finance people to help me get the money. I need a constructor to tell me whether or not what I have in mind can be built. And then I need the fifth member of the team, which is what we want to talk about, the architect. And I need that person iteratively through the process. I think I want to put up an apartment building. I don't want you to design the whole thing. Give me just enough schematics that I can go see if I can get an approval, go talk to the brokers and see if that will hit the market. Get my constructor to give me a rough estimate of cost. Now, it looks like it flies. Okay, get me to detailed design. You're not going to do the working drawings yet. I'm going to take that detailed design and really now sharpen up the pricing, see whether I can pre-rent or pre-sell based on that. And the architect is not making those decisions. The architect is either interacting with the other players or getting the feedback from the owner and being told, it's got to be a little taller, a little shorter, the floors aren't working, whatever. So that's the what in very brief terms of the process. Why? Several reasons, but the primary one is to make money. And most of the people in the business want to make a lot of money. And the way they make a lot of money is by putting as little of their own money into the project as possible, borrowing as much as they can, putting up as little equity as they can, and then in many cases, finding other people to partner with them to put up the equity so that the slice is as small as possible. And that feeds back to the architect. The owner wants to know that he can do it for his budget. And one of the primary things he wants from the architect is a project that can be built within the cost guidelines. There are other reasons that they tend to do it. A certain amount of ego gets involved. You've got lots of people in this business who are billionaires and they keep doing it even though they don't need the money because that's who they see themselves as being. A little bit of the Ozymandias complex. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my work, see mighty in despair. And finally, they do it because it's there. And in some cases, if they're a big enough organization or institution, they built themselves up through a boom, and then they've hit the downturn, and they don't want to get rid of their team, so they keep going. And each of those factors influences what it is they want the architect to do for them. Now, then you come down to where, who, and how. And I thought the easiest thing to do was to look at three quick examples. Somebody wants to put up a 250-unit apartment building on a cross street, 2 or 3 blocks from here. He's assured of the market. The university will take a quarter of the units. It fits the zoning. What does he want from the architect? He'd like a good-looking building, but mostly what he wants is pretty plain vanilla. He wants a building that works, that's efficient. He wants a building where the systems, the heating, air conditioning, and the elevatoring work, satisfy the residents of the building, but aren't over-designed. He wants a building that is efficient, where he gets at least 85% net rentable area to gross, because at the end of the day, he's getting his revenue based on the actual space to rent. And he wants a building that he can build for his cost estimate. So efficiency is also a matter of don't give me a fancy curtain wall, don't give me an oversized lobby, give me something that fits the budget. But by the way, having taken all of that into account, it would be nice if it would look good. Then we move a couple of miles south, and back to my example, we're on, you're going to wrap the table around the protocol. You're on 57th Street between 6th and 8th, and the market for condominiums is red hot. There's flight capital from all over the world, Chinese, Russians, Middle Eastern, just looking to park money in New York, and they're paying $5,000, $6,000 a foot, provided they have decent views, and you can get $1,000 a foot or more for renting the ground floor retail space, but the buyers want to know they have views, so you've got to start the apartments 30 stories up so you clear the sight lines around you, and so you think a hotel is a good idea, and there's a hotel shortage, and you get someone to take the hotel space, and now you're presenting the architect with a somewhat more complicated problem. He's got to, marketing real estate is all about location, location is about the address. You need 3 different entrances to this building. You need 2 different lobbies. You need separate elevator systems. You may or may not need separate mechanical systems. Now the architect's starting to work with complexity and a jigsaw puzzle and refereeing competing demands between different users. Ultimately, the owner's doing the refereeing, but the architect's got to balance all of that in his design. And then, now the owner as well, and looking for his $5,000, $6,000 a foot, is saying, well, can't have plain vanilla. I want pizzazz, whatever that means. I want something that's distinctive. And as you look around the New York skyline at buildings built after the great buildings downtown and after the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building, there are not a whole lot of buildings of great architectural distinction, but your owner would like one of those, please. And it would help, the other thing he wants from his architect is if not only the design, but the name has a cachet. If it's Frank Gehry without the building twisting, maybe that'll get me another $500 a foot. So that's the second kind of where issue. And then the third, let's leapfrog another 2-3 miles south and west and go to the Hudson Yards. And now the owner's got a very different problem. Thinks he's got an endless market for residential. He's got an indeterminate market for commercial. He went chasing it when there used to be a banking industry, and he expected that he'd be able to fill up millions of feet of big office space with banks, and none of the banks are moving. So he's not really certain of his market. The first 2 examples, the place was 100% location. The architect didn't have to do anything about helping him create the location. The Hudson Yards, just walk down 10th or 11th Avenue from 42nd Street down to the High Line. You're in no man's land. What does the architect help the owner do to create a place there? Does he do it with individual buildings? Does he do it the way the buildings are grouped? This is the stuff that I had to deal with through decades. The Toronto Housing, World Financial, Canary Wharf, Yerba Buena in London. A building and a project, the 3 million square foot project we didn't do in Frankfurt. How do you create a new place? That is a real challenge for the owner. That's a real challenge for the architect. It's an even bigger challenge if there isn't a master plan and the owner has to get, or owners have to get a group of architects together cooperating. So that is the where part. And then the who and how depends on who the owner is. There are people putting up major office buildings in this town who, in one case, had one of the major owners in the city had never built an office building. In another case, has built a few buildings in the last decade, but before that, for 30, 40 years, he just bought buildings. And they don't particularly know how to put up an office building. They don't have any of the feedback that comes from having done it forever. There are other owners, Boston Properties, Brookfield, Tishman Speyer, who've been doing it for decades, who have institutional memory, who build buildings, operate buildings, market them to tenants, and who have constant feedback about what works, what doesn't work. What the owner wants from his architect depends on the owner's experience and what he knows himself. The 2 sessions with Olympia in York, in New York and London, we had on staff 3 or 4 architect planners. We brought architects in and we said, this is your design brief, this is what we want. Be creative within the brief, but we know exactly what we want you to do. On the other hand, there's a man putting up prominent buildings in the heart of downtown who turns to David Childs and says, what should I do? You do it. And the architect has that range of opportunity. I think I'm out of time.
Okay. We'll get back to fill in some of the things that you talked about. Larry, do you want to kind of address the same things, but from a not-for-profit point of view, where they are you're going to do better if you leave it in the first stand post, I think. And talk about what things are similar and what things are different and why. Obviously, the goals are different.
Well, let me start out by saying I think there's a lot of wisdom in what Michael's had to say, and a lot of what I will have to say will disagree totally. And my prejudice, which I will disclose up front, is that in my career I have worked mostly with lawyers, financial advisors, and architects. And by far, I think architects are the most interesting of the lot. Going back to my graduate school days at Princeton, where I did not study architecture, I was in public policy school, but the architecture school was right across the street, and by far the best parties at Princeton were thrown by the architecture school. I was been fortunate, I think, in my career, never to be in a position to think of architects as necessary burdens. Pay them as little as possible out of what's left in the budget. That their role, and I'm purposely exaggerating parts of what you're saying, Michael, and ignoring other parts, but that their role is only to make buildings a little bit shorter or a little bit taller. Plain vanilla is what most developers want most of the time. I've been fortunate. I've been fortunate where I've been in a position much more like what Michael was saying at the end of his remarks, to look to architects for the big idea. To have architects not just be, kind of the right fielder of the softball team where you stick the player who has to be on the field, and as long as he doesn't screw up too much, you feel pretty good. But rather, I've thought of architects as the pitcher or the shortstop or the center fielder right at the heart of what makes a great project. And to be sure, some of that comes from my background in the nonprofit sector rather than the for-profit sector, and I'll get into that in a minute. But I would say one of the reasons that there are not a lot of buildings of great distinction in Manhattan is there are not a lot of owners of great distinction in Manhattan. Michael worked for a company that did give a damn about design and planning, and the results showed it. But most owners fall into, I want to get so much per square foot out of this and don't do anything in the design that's going to screw that up for me. So this question of where you are, though, is important. Michael raised it at the beginning, but he didn't really ask you. How many of you are architecture students? How many of you are in the real estate program where you primarily, okay, and do you also study architecture as well? No? Okay, so it's pretty separate. So let me start out by saying how I think, not-for-profit developers are the same, or share values with for-profit developers. We all want nice projects that are functional and work for their purpose. We all want our projects to finish on time and on budget. We all want buildings that work well for whatever their use. My use has been concert hall, theater, public civic space kind of use, not private rental of office or apartments. But in both cases, we want the building to work well. We want the operating costs to be reasonable and not excessive as a result of the design. So I think there's a lot shared. Nonprofit owners and builders, however, do differ in really significant ways. And when I talk about nonprofit, I'm talking about my background, which is Carnegie Hall, the New Jersey Performing Arts Center, UDC, which built tens of thousands of units of housing in 3 new communities, including Roosevelt Island, around the state. Museums, social service agencies, and governments. Paul, over coffee, was pointing out to a student that governments are the largest consumer of architectural services in this country, and that's important for you to understand. And somewhere in my remarks, I'm going to make a big pitch for those of you studying architecture and real estate to consider careers in the public or quasi-public sector, because I think that's a really satisfying place to work. And maybe some of what I say today will lead you to that conclusion. So if you're a nonprofit developer, you start with the mission of your organization. And the mission is not to make money. In this world today, a nonprofit leader who doesn't keep one lobe of his or her brain on finances is not going to be around very long in their position. But making money is not at the top of the list of why the organization exists. The mission might be, as it was at Carnegie Hall, to be the central place for great music in the world. At the New Jersey Performing Arts Center, there was a more layered and complex mission. We wanted to be a great performing arts center that wouldn't feel shy about standing shoulder to shoulder with Lincoln Center or the Kennedy Center. But we also wanted to be a place for children. We wanted to be a place that was a driver of Newark's revitalization. And we wanted to be a place where social goals, such as racial integration, equality of opportunity, equality of access for suburbs and urban families and children, old people, young people, where everybody really had a chance at the performing arts. It was meant to be taking the Kennedy Center as the antichrist of what art centers are. It's on a hill, it's a hermetically sealed box, it screams, "Approach me by limousine." There's metro stop a quarter of a mile from the Kennedy Center, but you can't get from the metro stop to the Kennedy Center without crossing two highways. And everything about the Kennedy Center was what we took as our negative example in Newark. Similarly, Lincoln Center, and I tread carefully here, but suffice it to say that Lincoln Center just spent $1 billion, $1 billion with a B, dollars over the last decade to make itself as accessible and people-friendly as NJPAC was from the day it opened its doors in 1997. So I don't dismiss out of hand that Lincoln Center was conceived at different times by different people with different values and different societal norms, but the fact is that Lincoln Center didn't quite achieve the palace on the hill feeling of the Kennedy Center, but it was still an art center that you had to climb up onto a plinth to approach, and there was a little bit of you have to do that to the arts if you feel like you want to be part of Lincoln Center. So mission is extremely important. Social goals are important. Dollars are also important, and I will say this, that those nonprofits that are doing best these days, and I think this will become even more true in the future, are the nonprofits that are entrepreneurial in their goals and in their way of doing business. So more and more you see nonprofits embracing real estate planning and real estate goals as part of their missions. It was explicit at NJPAC. From day one, part of our goal was to make Newark a better place. But also part of our goal was to have some control of the destiny of the land around NJPAC, so it wouldn't just be a toss-up as to whether the neighborhood that we were investing so much money in would be a good and supportive neighborhood for an art center. So what we did was buy all the land around us and said we'll be patient about how we plan and use that land, but in the end we'll control it. And unlike Lincoln Center, we will capture the value that we are bringing to the area and turn that value back into a subsidy for the art center. Think of where Lincoln Center would be today if it had bought the land across Broadway and Columbus Avenue. All of that money went to private developers and private landowners. None of that got captured by Lincoln Center to help support the nonprofit mission. I will just wind up by saying there are differences in how nonprofits approach their real estate development activities. And think of the ones who did. Carnegie Hall did a 50-story tower working with a private developer on this little tiny sliver of property next to Carnegie Hall. The Museum of Modern Art did a beautiful residential tower on West 53rd Street called Museum Tower. Cesar Pelli was the architect. He was also the architect of the building next to Carnegie Hall. WNET sold its air rights. BAM in Brooklyn is now being much more creative than it had previously been in trying to have an active role in developing its neighborhood. Playhouse Square in Cleveland, the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust, 14 blocks in downtown Pittsburgh. These are all development projects driven by nonprofits. But it's different. Nonprofits don't have the expertise of an Olympia and York. We don't have 3 or 4 architects on staff. We don't have real estate experts of the same quality earning, big salaries on staff. We really need to get that expertise elsewhere. And one of the places we get it, frankly, is from architects and choosing good architects. We are concerned with the market for whatever is being built privately as part of the nonprofit effort, but we are not so desperately and intensely concerned with the market because that's really the developer's expertise and the developer's risk. I would argue, this is for the real estate folks, that it would be inappropriate for nonprofits to take major real estate risks. What nonprofits should do, in my view, is to shape the environment through creating a plan to which the for-profits have to adhere, approving the architects that the for-profits pick, having some control over certainly the planning decisions and probably the exterior design decisions of the private developers, but doing the projects on some kind of ground lease or controlled sale basis where the nonprofit gets out of the way of the developer in the end and lets the developer do what it does best, but under a certain set of prescribed conditions. Nonprofits who have done this and pulled this off have found that they have successfully shaped their environments. They have nice projects next to them. They find expansion space for themselves in the projects and have created and generated significant revenue to help support the nonprofit mission. And then I will wind up where I started, with architects. The two architects that I worked with, Jim Polshek, who was once dean of this school for maybe a decade or more, and Barton Myers, who started out in Toronto, where Michael started out and now practices in California, were major foundation players they were the Tom Seaver of our projects. They really had very serious roles in shaping the projects, in the ideas well beyond the design ideas, and they, I think, would look back on their careers and think of the Carnegie Hall project and the NJPAC project as two of their greatest accomplishments. Finally, last point, those of you going on into architecture, I think, find that as exciting a profession as it is so demanding. You must be financially shrewd. You must be creative. You must be a mediator. You must be a psychologist. You must be a politician in order to advocate for the variances and the permits and figure out the public approvals and how to get them. It's a hugely complex and ever fascinating profession, and I think you've chosen very, very wisely.
Great. I'm sure that's reassuring, right? In case you had any doubts. Let's go back to what I started as the original question, but then Michael and Larry both amplified, I think, very usefully. How do you, I think something that comes into every aspiring architect's mind is, how do we get chosen to do a project? And I guess the best place to answer that is not from an architect, but from a client. How do you choose architects? I don't know who wants to go first.
I'm happy to. I've been involved in choosing them in a number of ways. Notice the people that Larry talks about, his great experience. By the way, Larry, I started out with a nonprofit assembling 45 acres of land, of derelict land in Toronto, building nonprofit housing, making it available to nonprofit co-ops, and you still had to know what the program was, and you still had to be able to design something that could be built on budget, or you wouldn't get your federal funding to build it. And the UDC and all the stuff that's built has got all the same strictures. So my starting point was the architect needs to understand that a program has to be developed. If you're building a museum or a performance center, you've got your approval, you've got your money, and now you're free to play with the boundaries. That's one thing. If you've got to determine, what am I going to build? What will the market accept? What will the lender accept? That's an interactive process that the architect's in the middle of, but he can't drive it. If there isn't financial feasibility, there isn't a project, and if there isn't a project, the architect doesn't have his commission. Now, in doing major projects, or even doing the things that we did in Toronto in the early 70s, you tend to go to people with proven track records. You tend to go, and by the way, the two people that you mentioned were not fresh out of school doing something for the first time. You go to people who've done it before, who know this works, this doesn't work, and then can bring the creative spark of, and I think I'll leap to doing that. So the major developers in this city doing projects go to KPF, whom we hear from next week, go to Skidmore, in particular David Childs. He used to go to Pay Cobb, Kevin Roach. They go to the people who've built not the best buildings, not the Citicorp Center, but the Time Warner Center, or the Bear Stearns, now J.P. Morgan building, the best of its kind of a developer building which can be iconic, in which the client can relate to and say, I'm proud that that's my building, but it's got to work. And so my starting point, by the way, and I have this ongoing argument with my partner, wife, who is a designer. Form follows function. Start from the inside out. I want my architects to give me buildings that work, and then to give me the pizzazz and give me the marketing ability. So we've gone to established architects, but for both Canary and the waterfront for both World Financial Center and the waterfront in Canary, we had design competitions. We were, I think, probably the first firm going back to the 80s who paid the architects to make submissions at the design competition, went from 6 to 3 down to 1, and by the time we were through the competition process, we were halfway through schematics, which the architect insisted on being paid for as schematics and not as part of the design proposal. For small-scale stuff, for people coming new to the business, they'll take more chances. But if you're talking about Tishman Speyer or Brookfield or Boston Properties, they're going to go with people who are tried and true, who are going to give them something that works.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Paul's question. How do you choose an architect? Well, I am a firm believer that one way you don't choose an architect is a design competition. And I say that because I really believe that great buildings are a function of a rich and complicated and layered collaboration between an owner and an architect. And you just don't get that if the owner isn't up to his or her ears in the early stages of design. So I really don't think design competitions are a good way. I do agree with Michael that you want experience. When we were picking an architect for NJPAC, we only considered architects who had done theaters. But I'll tell you, a lot of architects stepped forward who had done theaters, who had done pretty bad theaters. And I also agree with Michael that the functionality was important. So you want somebody who's done your building type. You want somebody whom you feel in your bones, and more than that, by deep referencing, is collaborative. So you have a partnership that really works together, like a marriage. You're living together for a 2-year design period and a construction period. So you really has to be somebody you can trust and you want to work with. And then I would say you have to find somebody with passion. I think that's really important. I do not believe in this, architect as functionary. I believe in the architect as a major player in the creation of the product. I'm going to give you 2 examples and then stop of things that happened in my New Jersey project. The first was, as we traveled the country, we visited the architects' buildings and their offices. We had 12 architects on the long list, then we got to a 3-4 architect short list. And we visited, on the short list, we visited all their buildings and their offices. And you can really learn a lot from visiting an architect's office. When we went to visit a certain architect, whom I shall not name, but whose office is in Princeton, New Jersey, and whom everyone thought we would pick because he was the only New Jersey architect on the list, getting to his office was sort of like trying to approach the inner sanctum of Fort Knox. You had to be shown in by 3 sets of underlings, and then you finally got to the great man himself, who deigned to give you 15 minutes of his time. The whole thing dripped of elitism and hierarchy. When we got to Barton Meyer's office in California, he had his office in a building called the Ice House, which was a former ice house, where the exterior windows, those spaces were all turned into conference rooms and libraries, where all the architects, including Barton, worked at the middle, and his desk was no bigger than anybody else's desk. And when he had a client there for a meeting, they would go into one of the library offices around the perimeter with the natural light and so forth. This ties into a second part of my story on how to pick an architect. My thought when I started in New Jersey was that we should do something, like Bilbao, really iconic. I had this giant picture of the Sydney Opera House on the wall of my office. And the idea I had in my head was, Newark is thought of the way Newark has been thought of in the 47 years since the riots in 1967. It was thought of as a place that couldn't possibly be home to a great performing arts center. And I said the way to get over that would be to, do a Bilbao. And sure enough, we had Frank Gehry was on our long list. Interestingly enough, in a partnership with David Childs. If there was ever an odd combination, that was it.
Same combination that went after the New York Times building, and a week before the competition was due, dropped out together.
Well,
They did that together very successfully.
dropped out together. It was really through talking to Myers that I finally got through my thick skull that given the goals of what we were trying to do, to have the People's Art Center, to have something that everyone could feel part of, whether you were a school teacher earning $23,000 a year or a captain of industry earning 7 figures, everyone could feel part of. Absolutely the wrong idea was the Sydney Opera House. This is this thing that looks great across the harbor, but it turns its butt end to the city. You have to walk all the way around it to get in. It's very unwelcoming. It's like, in a sense, the Kennedy Center in that it's a sealed-off space capsule. And what we really wanted was something that nestled comfortably and contextually within the streetscape and materials used in Newark. Something glass and brick and steel, something unlike everything else that had been built since the riots. That was not a bunker or a fortress, something that was welcoming and transparent, something where people felt that going to an art center was not going to church, but kind of a place that could be a regular part of your ordinary day-to-day life. And that big idea, which I believe is one of the key ingredients for the success we've had over the last 15 years, since the Art Center's been open, came from Barton Myers.
2 or 3 comments, Paul.
Okay.
Number one, I don't think Larry's ever run an architectural competition, because if you look at World Financial Center, we had 6 firms. They had 3 or 4 weeks, very preliminary, and we got apples, oranges, and grapefruits. And we got rid of the plums and the pears, and we went with those 3. And then we said, do another month's work. And by having 3 people working at the problem at once, all from different perspectives, you don't have the luxury of the nonprofit where it might happen in 2 years and it might happen in 5 or 10. You're trying to capture a market. And it advanced the thinking immensely to have 3 competent firms going full tilt. And then we had 5 years of interaction with Caesar. And, the fact this is not a public design competition where what you get is inherited in stone and there's political problems, that got us to the start of schematics. And then you went to work with the architect and you pushed and pulled to make it better. I also wanted to amend one of the things I said in terms of the role of the architect. And you see a cog in the wheel. When I say cog, I started out saying interactive, interdisciplinary. To the extent that the program has to be developed and it has to be economic, then it's an interaction between the architect, who at the very beginning is saying, okay, you want an apartment, here's the scheme, and the financial advisors and the marketing advisors and the construction advisors and the planning advisors, but the architect's not going to drive it. It's going to be back and forth between all of them, and the developer is then going to take all that and maximize what he can do. On the other hand, the less the client knows, the more the architect can do. You're going to hear from Gene next week, I hope, if Paul finds some property. He's going into cities in China. The mayor's welcoming him with open arms, and he wants 6 million square feet of housing and commercial right there on this piece of land in the middle. What do you want? I don't know. Now the architect has free scope to be as creative as possible because the client doesn't have a clue. The more the client knows and the better advice he gets from all these other people, the more the architect becomes part of the team and not the creative genius who's driving it.
Two things. Those of you who took practice last semester know this. You're just hearing it for a second time. I've always made a big point that the students here are all very different. They're not clones. And hopefully what you are hearing today is that clients are very different too, and they want different things, and some of these would be things that you'd love to work for in either case, and some of these things that don't match your personality. So this is a perfect opportunity to get a little bit of insight into what I talk about endlessly, about how you're all different, and clients are all different, and the important thing is to get the right fit between the architect and the client, because the wrong fit is really unpleasant. That's one thing. The second thing is, you both make the very valid point that in big projects you want to hire somebody who's very familiar with that building type. You're doing an office building, whether it's a central core or side core, depending on the site and so on. Very important. There's a lot to know, and you can't just be doing it for your first time. Nevertheless, what I'd like to hear from you about is the answer to a question. One of the things I always ask students on day one is, what do you see yourself, what would you like to be doing in 10 years? And they all say the same thing. Universally, I think maybe out of every student, there are maybe 3 or 4 who don't give the answer as, I'd like to be running my own office, small design-oriented studio type thing, collaborative with people I like, and so on. This is not the way you're going to get one of these projects. So I guess what I'd like to hear from each of you is, what is your advice to the students who gave that answer, not the Cesar Pelles who have, or the Gene Cohns who have 100 huge projects already built? What would you say to students who want to do that? What would be your advice?
Go apprentice, learn your trade, learn the nuts and bolts, make some contacts, get to work with some of the clients of the big firms, and then spin off and try and do some smaller stuff. But don't walk out the door and think, okay, I can get a client who will let me design an office building when I never have. It's unlikely. You may be able to do renovation work, which is, the building's there, you've just got to figure out how to reconfigure the rooms. That's easy.
I would agree with Michael. I found it's really important to learn what the gold standard is shortly after getting out of graduate school. I was really fortunate to have landed a spot at the New York State Urban Development Corporation under Ed Logue, and he was the gold standard. Nobody did ever in this country in terms of urban rejuvenation anything close to what Ed did in terms of quality and pace and conviction about its importance. So I think it's important to learn what the best of the best is, and you all have the advantage of coming with Columbia degrees, so that gives you a really good leg up. You know Professor Segal, who knows just about everybody in the world, and he might be able to get you in the door for an interview, and I think that's really important. But I would also like to make a pitch for how satisfying it is to do things like going to work for city planning commissions and landmark commissions and mayors who have economic development corporations and really do want to and care about changing their cities. You have to be really careful here because there's corruption and venality and the possibility of political paralysis. But I will say that a career in a nonprofit or in government, if it's the right government, the de Blasio government seems to me an extremely exciting place to think about working. The City Planning Commission is going to have a much different kind of advocacy role than planning commissions have had probably, for 3 or 4 mayors going back. It's going to be at the center of urban redevelopment action in a different way. And I think these kinds of careers can be extremely exciting and satisfying. So in addition to trying to land an apprenticeship at a really great firm, which I think is a good idea, I would urge you to consider some form of quasi or public quasi employment as well.
Well, one of the things that I've always stressed, which you reinforce in a funny way, is I've always stressed the value of learning both the nuts and bolts. You come out of here and you're probably going to be as knowledgeable about how to do schematic design as you're likely to be without a lot more experience under your belt. What you don't know anything about, though, realistically, is the nuts and bolts and the craft of it, and learning the process enough so that you can have some control and get what you want actually done. So I think those are 2 great pieces of advice. The other thing that Larry said, which I agree with, many of you come out with the notion that if you had worked for the government or for a developer or for a contractor, that would be a black mark on your record when you go to try to get a job with an architect's office. And that may be the case with some architects' offices, and those are the ones you should stay away from. The smart ones will look at that experience as being very valuable. And to the extent that you've got some credentials or experience that your peers don't, puts you in a very competitive advantage. So I think that aside from doing good, you will do well. So just because we're getting vaguely towards when they have to go to studio and unlearn a lot of what you've been talking about, they know that I'm very anti-school culture. What were some experiences, without naming names, that you've had with architects that would be good lessons for these people to learn about what not to do to alienate clients and never get hired again?
I'll start with a positive and a negative. On the positive side, I urge you to develop your presentation skills. Your verbal skills, your ability to stand up and in 5 or 10 minutes really be able to turn on an audience and get them excited about what it is you're advocating. Nobody, in my experience in the architectural profession, did this better than Jim Polshek. He got all his facts wrong. And, his staff would sit there rolling their eyes at how he got the square footage wrong, and he got the location wrong, and he got the cost wrong, and it didn't matter. At the end of 10 minutes of listening to Jim Polshek, you would follow him anywhere, and that's an extremely valuable skill. And I would say, particularly as of the husband of somebody who teaches that. My wife has a presentation skills firm and is not looking for clients, so I'm not pushing it for that reason. But this can be taught. And if you don't feel you're good at that, those of you who are good at it know you're good at it. But if you don't feel you're good at it, get good at it. It is really important. The other thing is, in terms of skills, one of the things that I most appreciated about my collaboration with Barton Myers, who always used to say, we are the architect, whoever was at the table. It was the planning consultant and the theater consultant and the acoustician and the engineer and so forth. It was always a we. And what I appreciated most about Barton, other than just his sheer talent, which was monumental, was that whenever we had a cost problem, which we always did at every stage of design, you get the schematics costed, and they're $5 million over the budget. And then you fix that problem, you get to design development, you get those costed, you're $3 million over the budget. What Barton did at those stages, instead of digging in his heels and being pedantic and saying, my design is, so great that it can't all be modified, he said, give me 3 or 4 days, and I will create the list of things that you can take out of this project that won't make a difference. And it'll still be a great project. And I will never forget the moment. We always wanted a wooden room for the main 2,800-seat hall. our instructions to him was make us feel like we're sitting inside a cello. And he did it, and he did it so beautifully, this amazing wood room. And if you know the big halls in the region, and even if you go up as far as Boston, there are no wood rooms. Now there is Segal Hall in the basement of Carnegie Hall. But before that, there were no wood rooms. And, you know, you hear with your eyes, not just your ears, and we felt if the room was warm, you would hear warm. And that was part of it. And I guess it was during design development, it just came that we were so far over and the wood was just so expensive. And he said, well, we're going to eliminate the wood on the walls. And we said, Martin, you can't. It's the heart of the design. How are we going to, you know, it was a role reversal. He was saying take it out, and the owner was saying leave it in. And he said, trust your architect. It will still feel like a wood room. Well, the fascia of the balconies are wood. The overhangs on the doors are still wood. The entrance and the exits, mahogany stained cherry. The floor is a beautiful maple. There was enough wood in that room that anybody who goes in there says, I've been in a wood room. And he did that over and over again with different elements of the project. Don't worry about eliminating these, it'll still be fine. And then he would, on the other side of the line, say, don't touch these, or you're really going to compromise the quality.
You know, part of the reason to work for somebody who's a good mentor, who will teach you and who will respect you, is that you learn these things and you can go do them. I think early on in our practice, we were sitting there. We were doing a project with another architecture firm, Rothschild, Kaiserman, Thompson, and B. And Bernie Rothschild, I don't know, did either of you ever? Bernie Rothschild was this amazing public, civic-minded guy. And we had, it was a very complicated project. And at one point, the two different clients were sitting there with their head in their hands, just very upset about everything. And Bernie was a very reassuring guy, and he kind of leaned over, and he said, what can I do to help? And those few words just totally changed the relationships and changed the tone, and everybody did get together and solve it. And it was just his attitude of not digging in his heels, but saying, what can I do to help? Of viewing it as a group project, not as a me versus you or anything like that. Any additions about, now you didn't really answer the question of what should an architect not do. And maybe being positive is a better thing, so I won't hold you to it.
My bête noire my bête noire has always been architects who don't listen to the client and don't listen to what the client wants. Larry says it's very important to be educated by the architect. We've had experiences with architects. One of our proposal calls was 25 years ago for what became the Hudson Yards. We had a plan to redevelop between 31st and 34th Street from Madison Square down to the river. One of the country's top 20 architects was among the ones invited to make a proposal. It was to start with two commercial office buildings between 7th and 8th Avenue, 31st to 33rd, for the traditional New York office market. And this great architect came in with two 60-story, 10,000-foot towers. And we never talked to him again because we paid him to make a design, and he told us our program was wrong. If he thought the program was wrong, he shouldn't have taken the money and he shouldn't have submitted. One of the world's renowned, one of Britain's renowned architects, one of the major ones.
Has he been knighted?
No, he's beyond knighthood.
He's a lordship?
He designed a tower at Canary Wharf for us. And he wanted a certain look on the skin. And he wanted 10-foot column bays to get him that look. And we had an argument that started at the staff level and then went to me, and then he had to go talk to Paul Reichman. No, sir, we don't, sir at that time, we want 15-foot bays. Users want 225 square foot offices that are 15 by 15. They don't want offices that are 10 by 25. You're ruining my luck. You have to listen to us about what we know the user wants. We're in the market renting to them constantly. It was over his dead body. We designed, the same team, post-Olympia, New York, designed a project in Frankfurt, which fortunately didn't go forward. 3 million square foot retail office entertainment complex on the goods here. Two very famous European architects. One who was doing a retail entertainment complex, movie house up above with great seating, retail down below, and in order to support the movie house above, he kept dropping columns through the middle of the retail, making it unrentable. Please change it. It was a battle for weeks to get him to give you something that worked. His counterpart was designing the office tower. Gave us what we wanted, 25,000-foot floors, a 40-foot building, and the top of the building had a tomahawk on the top. Had a 60-foot protrusion that went up like this and down like this and ended in a blade, and you could see that building on the skyline, but you couldn't build it. And you really, it's a waste of time and effort. At the end of the day, you win the argument, but you're really annoyed that you have to spend as much time arguing in order to get on to a building that works. And these are the creme de la creme that I'm talking about.
Well, by one definition. By another, they sound like idiots.
Well, there's one of them who's doing a 90-story tower at 57th and 7th.
We'll see how that goes.
I look at it every day. It's ugly.
It sure is. It sure is. I can't imagine that anybody would want that building in their portfolio, but that's a personal opinion. Okay, questions?
People are paying $100 million.
Yes, I know.
For apartments
I know.
at the top.
It's astounding.
Yes.
Do you guys have any questions? Now, last week when I asked, or 2 weeks ago when I asked for questions, some of you said, well, I didn't really feel like I knew enough to ask an intelligent question. Don't worry about that. They always say there are no dumb questions, only dumb answers. By the way, I have had occasion to prove that comment wrong, but in any event, yes.
I guess it was gradual. He didn't hit me over the head with it. We kind of learned together, maybe. And I think it also had to do with seeing some of the buildings of the other architects who had done theaters, and when you saw their buildings, you kind of said, you know, the building was more about the architect than it was about the city or about the use. And it was gradual. I think I'm overdrawing that was the only factor in changing the direction, but it was a very important one. And I would say we learned together. We visited a lot of different theaters together, and we kind of gradually got to the place that, you know, let's do the right thing here, and not necessarily. And interestingly enough, when Paul Goldberger, we borrowed a helicopter. Paul was still the architectural critic of the Times, and we borrowed a helicopter and brought him over from Manhattan to come look at what we had under construction. And, you know, we were essentially cultivating him, and he took one look at it. He said, "You've made an interesting decision to build something contextual rather than building something that's going to, you know, wind up on the cover of all the architectural journals."
Which it did anyway.
Yeah, it did anyway.
But another answer to your question, if I can answer, and you've heard this answer before, I know, and that is trust. You know, the whole deal between the owner and the architect is a relationship. And it's like any relationship. If there's a lot of trust there, which doesn't happen fast, and as Larry said, it's a process, happens over time. But once there's trust, you can say things that without trust would be unacceptable, but with trust, you know, what's the goal? To become your client's trusted advisor. And once you are that client, and you have something intelligent to say that you really thought out, and even if it's contrary to what you expect they want to hear, they will hear it.
And, you know, that goes both ways. Let me just jump in here. You know, Myers has a range of aesthetic sensibilities. And on one end, I'm sure you saw his Michael up in Toronto, he does all these steel houses, like all architects, only architects love poured concrete. Nobody else likes concrete, just architects. But I saw Barton's other buildings, and there was a lot of exposed concrete. And I just said, you know, the rule here in New Jersey is no exposed concrete. And he was fine with that, once we set the rule.
You know the rule at the Getty for Richard Meyer was it can't be white. And it was a big enough job where he found some other colors. Other questions? Yes?
I'm not sure whether the should is moral or legal. You had to convince somebody to come in and undertake a project, which, again, the feasibility of which, all of that space downtown in the middle of Silverstein building more space, and what was there in Brookfield Properties, Brookfield Place, World Financial Center, what was there in New York Plaza, all the negotiating leverage was with the developer, and he wanted to be able to do a building which he said worked, and if you didn't let him do that, he wouldn't take it on.
If you're a developer, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit, you have the final word. And if you don't think that, and if you don't act that way, you shouldn't be the developer. There's a famous story about Rockefeller Center where when it was in construction in, I guess, the 20s, Diego Rivera, the famous and extremely left-wing Mexican muralist, had been commissioned to do a mural. And when John D. Rockefeller saw the completed mural, which was very much a working man's mural, you know, borderline revolutionary mural, he ordered it destroyed. And Ogden Nash, the humorist, wrote a poem about this. It wasn't a very long poem, but it explained it all. It said, after all, it's his wall.
Yes?
Is licensure important, or because there are many architects today who are leading offices and are not licensed, is something that is just as important as a reputation or track record or trust?
Is this a legal question? You're asking the question from a client's point of view.
Yes, in choosing an architect, there could be licensed architects within the office.
If you really like the work the person's going to do, they'll go and find somebody for a pittance to put a stamp on it.
But that's it. I don't think, although I'm
It's
not
not
sure.
going to affect your judgment of whether to use the person.
Yeah. But to be used without a license, if you're a local, I don't know too many. I know a lot of foreign architects who associate because they're not licensed here. I don't know of too many local architects who are not licensed who get big jobs.
Or is it just that they have people in their office who are licensed?
Yeah, they can. Yeah, well, the New York State law is pretty easy to, as long as the licensed person writes a letter saying that they've examined the drawings and to the best of their knowledge they, you know, meet professional standards and stuff. Yeah, you can stamp anybody's drawings. But I don't know too many big clients who are doing big projects with a foreign architect. That's a different deal. But with a local architect, did you ever hire a local architect who wasn't licensed? He couldn't call himself an architect.
Maybe to do construction supervision or something like that, but not to design.
Yeah. It's not that it's painful to get a license, but just suck it up and do it. Yes, David.
You guys both mentioned sort of, in one case, sort of the architect doing the building that works as a priority, and sort of for examples of where the architect is able to develop a creative solution from costing. But I'm curious about examples that you've encountered where the architect is actually able to add value, whether through that creative kind of solution to keeping the work uniform, sort of, how to maintain functionality but in an interesting way that ends up being unexpected but adds value.
Well, I think the fact that Myers loved theaters, was steeped personally in the history of theaters back to Greek amphitheaters, really lent a huge amount of value to how our theater came out. He brought a aesthetic to it, to be sure, but he also brought deep respect for the public experience of going to theater. I won't try to create the whole narrative, but he would describe, and he isn't, to be honest, that eloquent a guy. I mean, he was not Jim Polchak, that's for sure. But, he had a narrative about arriving at a theater and feeling the crowdedness of the lobby and checking out who's there and whom they're with and how they're dressed, and then filtering in and what it's like to sit down and when the room goes dark, and then the relationship of you and the stage. He had such a passion, as I said earlier, he had such a passion for theater and attending theater that he added, I think, a huge amount of value. On the other hand, with regard to functionality, that came from both sides. And I'll just give you one example. We visited a bunch of theaters around the country, art centers, not just theaters, art centers. And one thing we learned is you needed a space, a substantial space that could function independent of a performance. So that while you have the Alvin Ailey Dance Company and 3,000 people in the main theater, you can have the Prudential Insurance Company having a dinner for its top clients for 300 in another part of the building. And when you're running a nonprofit, the revenue you get from that second activity is really critical, blood revenue to fund the first. And I can't tell you how many theaters around the country made the mistake of not having these second major spaces that could operate independently of what was going on in the performance space for revenue purposes.
I tried to stress to you in terms of the architect's role, the where. So if you go up Park Avenue from 42nd to 59th, or you go up 6th Avenue of the Americas, same strip, try and recall a building of distinction. Very, very few. So it's hard for the architect to add value there. Who added value? These at the Seagrams building created an icon. Where the architect can add tremendous value, if you ask me, my favorite architect, the ones I've worked with, Caesar Pelli. How did Caesar Pelli add value at the World Financial Center? You've got your basic boxes that serve the financial services industry, and then he put together a composition that had to compete with the then World Trade Center. His design created the sense of place. He also, by the way, came up with the idea there was supposed to be a public space. He created the Winter Garden. But more than that, the composition of the four buildings, the two gatehouses, and the two southerly buildings, he made the place.
So how did he convince a bottom-line oriented developer to do a winter garden, which doesn't really return direct revenue?
We took a look at the cost within the first question. As I said to you, what can I do here, and then can I market it? And this wasteland of Battery Park had sat there for 10 years with 3 of the worst kind of left-rack buildings populating it. And now we were going to convince people like Merrill and American Express and Home Insurance to move there. And you have to make a place. And on top of that, you have these 10 million feet behind you that were iconic. Well, the architect created huge value by making the sense of place. The architects in World Financial Center, Skidmore created the site plan, and they did a very good job of doing that. And then we got the architects to work together in not just doing individual buildings, but creating an ensemble that felt like it had been there for some time. And there the architects create value. The architects create more value by helping create an address, helping create a sense of place when you're operating on the fringe. The huge challenge is going to be to see what Hudson Yards works out like. I have a concern from what I've seen that there are a bunch of pieces of sculpture being created that are going to be there independently, and you're going to look at them on the skyline, and why isn't that nice? And again, in the middle of it, and you're still going to be nowhere.
Of course, the classic example of that is Rockefeller Center, of different architects working together, creating a place, creating great value at a time when, boy, who would have invested anything in anything at that point?
So the value isn't that you make the building 2% or 5 or 10% more valuable, but that you make it marketable, that you manage to attract the critical mass of people who lead the rest who want to come.
We have time for one more question. I've always made a big point, don't just look at the design-oriented architecture firms to go, get experience in other things. Contractors, New York City contractors, all hire a lot of young architects. I don't know that developers do, but what's your experience with that?
Only the biggest of them, and then it'll help if you know somebody. But some of the architectural firms, Skidmore, divides itself up and has a technical department, also has an interiors department, and those are places where you can learn the nuts and bolts. And I'm sure I'm not sure they're hiring. Whether people are hiring or not depends on whether they're busy or not.
Yeah, and most firms, yeah. It's very different. You guys are in 3 or 4 months going to be facing a very different market than your peers 3 years ago were. That was really sad. You're coming into a good place. Any other questions? Perfect timing because it's 2:01. It's time for you guys to go to studio. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you both very much for doing it. No, that was fine. I would have wrapped the table eventually. Thank you very much.
The one thing that was